calendar of the Universal Church, All Saints Sunday always falls on the first Sunday in November. So our attention is properly tuned today to those who have joined the communion of the saints in heaven. But on our church calendar, today is also the program, the Sunday before New Consecration Sunday, and the format of this program calls for the pastor to preach a stewardship sermon on this occasion. When I first discovered this coincidence, I thought to myself, oh no, this is going to be like mixing oil and water. But upon further reflection, I realized it's not a stretch to talk about sainthood and stewardship in the same breath. Now, when you and I use the term saint, we're normally referring to Christians who distinguish themselves by their extraordinary piety and good works. In the Roman Catholic tradition, certain individuals are even canonized as saints because their spiritual achievements set them apart from run-of-the-mill Christians. And so, in the popular view, saints are a special breed of believers. Then there's the rest of us. The New Orleans Saints won their first and only Super Bowl title after the 2009 season. Their victory was all the more significant because for years they were the laughingstock of the National Football League. Their long-suffering fans were both incredibly loyal and highly critical of their team. Many of them wore paper bags over their heads at home games and called their team the Aints rather than the Saints. Well, that's how many of us feel about our status as saints in the body of Christ. Pardon the poor grammar, but saints we ain't. However, the Apostle Paul sees our status differently. In 2 Corinthians, we find Paul out on one of his missionary journeys where he's doing some old-fashioned fundraising. He appeals to the church at Corinth to provide financial support for the impoverished church in Jerusalem. Notice that he refers to the members of the Jerusalem church as saints. Not just a select few of them, but all of them. In the twinkling of an eye, our understanding of the word saint is turned upside down. Paul assumes that all Christians are already saints just by virtue of their relationship with Christ and the church. Yes, you and I may be flawed images of ideal saints, but by Paul's definition, we are saints nonetheless. Has it ever occurred to you that All Saints' Day is what it says it is? A time to honor all saints, both the living and the dead. And all includes us. At the same time, Paul is a realist. He knows that our attainment of sainthood in this life is only partial, still incomplete. This is why, in his introduction to 1 Corinthians, Paul addresses his readers as those who are called to be saints, as if they have not yet achieved sainthood, as if they're still saints in the making. So the question becomes, how do you and I become saints? In more than the generic sense. Saints in more than name only. Throughout his Corinthian correspondence, Paul is full of suggestions for those who are aspiring to sainthood. The main one being that we are called to practice love toward one another and toward our neighbors. Faith, hope, love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. But that's not very specific. You and I want to know what love looks like in concrete terms, right? Well, in 2 Corinthians, Paul spells out a specific way for Christians to demonstrate love. And in so doing, he makes a connection between sainthood and stewardship. To repeat the context, the apostle is taking up a collection to provide financial relief for the mother church in Jerusalem. He holds up the churches in Macedonia as models for sacrificial giving. They too are mired in poverty, yet they display what Paul calls a wealth of generosity to their sisters and brothers in Jerusalem. He appeals to the Corinthians to follow the example of their neighbors in Macedonia. He affirms the Corinthians for displaying many of the marks of sainthood. But he suggests that they still have room to grow in their likeness to Christ. Now as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in utmost eagerness, and in our love for you, so we want you to excel also in this generous undertaking of financial sacrifice. There you have it. Stewardship and sainthood mentioned in the same breath. For Paul, generous stewardship is one of the litmus tests of authentic discipleship. You and I can give ourselves to God and to the work of God's people in every other way, Paul says. But unless we give something out of our financial resources as well, our giving is incomplete. We are saints in the generic sense, but not in the fullest sense. Here goes. This morning I'm going to do something I've never done before in 42 years of preaching. I'm going to give a stewardship testimony, just like I've asked laypersons to do countless times during church stewardship campaigns. My intention, of course, is not to boast about how much I give, but rather to acknowledge my struggle to be a generous giver, to chronicle my growth as a giver, and to clarify why I hold myself to a certain standard of giving today. I'll start with the bottom line. I receive a salary from this church, and I tithe my income right back to the church. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the concept of tithing, a tithe is the biblical standard for giving, which is a minimum gift of 10%. And so, just for the record, I give in excess of 10% of my gross income, that's my income before taxes, to the Woodbury United Methodist Church. I have never before disclosed this kind of information publicly to any congregation I have served. I'm not required to reveal what I give. My giving is confidential, just like your giving is confidential. I am choosing to share my giving patterns with you today as part of my stewardship testimony. Let me make it clear, I'm not telling you that I'm a tither because I've had a sudden attack of hubris and want to hold myself up as an ideal steward, much less as an ideal saint. The real truth is that I have not always been a tither, and I have struggled just like the Corinthians struggled, and like many of you have struggled, to reach my potential in generous giving. When it comes to stewardship, a saint I ain't. I'll start back at the beginning of my adult life. Well, while I was a college and seminary student, I gave virtually nothing out of my pocketbook to the churches to which I belonged. And then I became a pastor for the first time when I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago Divinity School. I was called to serve a small white Baptist congregation part-time in the Hyde Park neighborhood of Chicago. About 2 months after I started, I had a routine meeting with the deacons of the church. But at the end of the meeting, the routine was shattered. The deacons confronted me with the fact that in my first 2 months as their pastor, I had not put a plug nickel into the church's offering. Now, believe it or not, they weren't being critical or shaming. To the contrary, they were expressing their concern for me. Was I in some kind of financial distress that kept me from giving at least some amount of my money to the work of the church? I replied that I had been contributing financially in other ways, mostly out-of-pocket expenditures, which I just turned into the church treasury. I also acknowledged to them that my financial resources were very limited. My wife and I had a combined income of $7,000 a year, and were barely making ends meet. But in my heart of hearts, I knew I was just making excuses. I felt obligated under God and obligated to the church I was leading to be a leader, not just an observer in the realm of giving. But again, my growth as a giver was not instantaneous. It was gradual. I didn't begin tithing my income until I was well into my second year as a full-time pastor. My starting salary at that church was $11,000. And while I was there, my family grew in number from 2 to 4. So it was a real challenge to set aside 10% of my income for the church offering plate. But I really had no excuses for not doing so. I mean, if I could afford to take my family out to eat occasionally, if I could buy season tickets for University of Illinois football games, if I could purchase a new car, which I did, and if I could make 2 expensive trips to Texas in that car each year, then I could afford to be a tither. But perhaps you're wondering, how did I settle on giving 10% of my income to the church? Almost no one would have known or cared if I had given less. The answer is that I realized my need for an objective standard for giving to God and the church. I knew that left to my own devices, I would always be tempted to fall back on subjective standards for giving. By that, I mean determining what I give on the basis of what I think I can afford, which usually means giving when there is enough left over to give after all my other financial obligations are met. I realized if I took that course, I would never be a generous giver because, like many of you, I would rarely have a large, comfortable cushion from which to give. The subjective starting point for giving also means supporting a church based on my evaluation of that church's behavior and effectiveness. If I agree with the church's mission and direction, if the church pleases me and meets my needs, then I will support it financially to the fullest. If not, I will hold back on my contributions or not support it at all. Now this may come as a shock to you. This is the gospel truth. There have been times in my ministry when I have actually thought about doing the latter. I have served churches that were so conflicted and toxic that I gave fleeting consideration to boycott with my pocketbook. But I realized that if I took that approach to giving, I would never give consistently and faithfully. Moreover, I would not only be withholding money from the church, I would be falling short of my obligation to God. Again, I realized early on that I needed an objective standard for giving, a standard that wouldn't fluctuate when my own finances were tight or when I was unhappy in the church I was serving. And this brings me back to the biblical concept of tithing I mentioned a moment ago. Tithing is based on the conviction that everything you and I possess is a gift from God and ultimately belongs to God. Tithing expresses this truth by encouraging us to give back to God a meaningful percentage of what is God's to begin with. A gift of 10% is an objective standard for giving, or if you prefer, a tangible goal for giving, an ideal for stewardship, which is thoroughly biblical and toward which you and I are challenged to grow. Now, I know that some of you may not currently be in a position to tithe your income. But I would be surprised if any of you lacks the capacity to grow in your giving, even if it's a small increase. By disclosing that I am a tither, I'm not bragging about how much I give or shaming you for giving less. You know very well that what I've shared in these last few minutes are the confessions of an imperfect saint. But I also believe this with all of my mind and heart. True sainthood and generous stewardship cannot be separated. God help us to put the two together and keep them together. Our giving should not be governed by how we feel about giving when we examine our bank statement, nor by how we feel at any given moment about the church we're giving to. Our giving should be based on what we believe and proclaim about God as the owner of all creation, and about ourselves as God's stewards. If we believe this and act upon it, we will put our money where our mouth is. It's just that difficult, and it's just that simple.